Hello, everyone, and welcome to our backyard sukkah. This is the last installment of a week of special Sukkot programming from Valley Beth Shalom. I hope you've enjoyed the learning. If you tuned into our Kol Nidre service this year, you might have been surprised by the second of two repetitions of this famous prayer. Traditionally, the Cantor sings Kol Nidre 3 times, but about 25 or 30 years ago, some congregations began using a beautiful cello piece by composer Ernest Bloch instead of the first repetition, so that it would go cantor, cello, cantor. And a number of people have asked me to try out this cello piece, but I thought for this year it might be more appropriate to use guitar, since that's the instrument that I sort of play. And that thought occurred to me during a phone conversation with a dear friend named Adam Del Monte. He just happens to be one of the world's greatest flamenco and classical guitarists. And when I asked him to share his artistry with us, to play what could be, and was, by the way, a deeply moving rendition of Kol Nidre, to my surprise, he said yes. If you heard it, I think you'll agree that a great artist can pray with his fingers. Adam also said yes when I asked him to be our guest today. Adam Del Monte was born in Tel Aviv, later moved to Spain, where he studied with the great flamenco masters. He now tours the world, having won multiple competitions and accolades everywhere. If I read his bio to you right now, I'm afraid we'll run out of time, so check it out on Google. Instead, let me welcome a very special guest to my sukkah, a dear friend and a wonderful artist, Adam Del Monte. Hello, Adam.
Hey, Phil, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you again so much for your brilliant performance on Kol Nidre. I have to say, I was looking at the crew because we didn't have a congregation, unfortunately. And the crew was just, their jaws were on the floor. And I've heard you play before, but they hadn't. So in any case, thank you again for that.
It was my pleasure.
So I mentioned that you were born in Israel, you lived in Spain, you're English, you sound, almost like someone who grew up in America. How do you think? What language is your natural fallback?
That I get asked that quite a lot, considering, having lived in different countries and having lived in different languages,
Yeah.
and cultures and mentalities, and adopting different mentalities. Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I mean, I think a visceral default, I would have to say, is Hebrew. That is my mother tongue. Even though I barely grew up there, I was 4 months old when I left with my parents. We went to Holland. And so I lived in Amsterdam for about 1.5 years or something.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I'm told I even spoke some Dutch, which I forgot, but baby level Dutch. whatever Dutch babies at age 2 speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I quickly forgot it because from there we moved to Malaga, Spain. And so Spanish, I think, I guess Dutch you could say was my second language, but let's discount that for a minute. But then it was Spanish. So I do think a lot in Spanish. I do think a lot in English. But when I really connect with my feelings, whether it's rage or excitement or anything like that, I think it's more Hebrew than anything else. But not exclusively. So it varies.
So interesting. I envy that ability. The other ability I envy is your incredible guitar playing. So I want to start with a really basic question about guitar. Guitars, there are guitars and there are guitars. So some guitars are really made for classical music and some are made for rock and roll, obviously. The flamenco has a particular history. I wonder if the flamenco guitar itself, could you share a little bit of that with me?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into heavy duty academic level, detail, the guitar is more of a descendant of the vihuela, which is the Spanish counterpoint to the lute.
Ah,
So the lute was of course kind of evolved in England, and the lute is an evolution of the oud, laud, oud, lute.
right.
So you can, even in the etymology, you can see the connection there, and of course in the shape and the whole construction. I mean, that this really annoying belly that the oud and the lute have, I could just never anatomically connect with that instrument. Just, how do people play this thing? So that was definitely a path I would have never chosen. The vihuela is sort of a precursor, an ancestor of the guitar that developed in Spain. Again, all these instruments, I mean, their genetic origins just go back, thousands of years, of course, as with evolution and with experimentation. But the vihuela is already an instrument that took a very specific shape in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, which was again an instrument that was very often, very commonly used by the troubadours, as well as court musicians and the like.
So it made its way into the Provence and parts of France as well.
Yeah. It kind of, obviously the troubadours were carriers of song and tale, and they did so through their instrument, the vihuela, and there's other derivatives of plucked versions of instruments. Like in Italy, it was the chitarrona, and then the various mandolins and so on, which are kind of different, of course. And then you have, again, connected to the lute, you have the theorbo, you have various types of lutes. I mean, and they all kind of, by natural selection, they just kind of watered down and distilled into, you had sort of the lute and the vihuela, and the repertoire that was written for these instruments is kind of defined their existence in many ways, due to the composers but again, there were still distinctions between those different instruments in terms of how many courses they had, how they were tuned. Scordatura, meaning alternate tuning, or the refers to alternate tuning or various tunings, natural tunings of these instruments. They would determine certain, that would facilitate the fingerings within certain keys that would make possible easier fingering in order to execute certain compositions. So very organic, you're saying, related to that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but then certain scales would lend themselves to a particular instrument.
Yeah. Had to do with their, Anyway, I think we're going into like UCLA level. But anyway, so out of the vihuela, eventually evolved, what we know as the Spanish guitar, and I think in the mid 19th century, I can't remember by who exactly, but these guitar-like, instruments. I mean, they just more and more began to sort of resemble what we see today as the guitar. Their bodies were smaller, they were lighter, they're of course much softer, the instruments, until Antonio Torre, sorry, the Spanish builder, turn of the previous century, sort of defined the certain blueprint that would become sort of the standard.
For flamenco or for classical?
Well, that's a good question. So back then, there was no real distinction between a flamenco guitar and a classical guitar, because the Torre instrument was, in essence, what today we would call almost a hybrid instrument. It had the sweetness for a classical guitar. I mean, those instruments, when you play them today, I mean, the ones that are well preserved sound amazing. I mean, they have a beauty and a poetry and a sweetness to them that is unparalleled. But at the same time, their tension is very low, and their action is quite low, which is a characteristic feature of flamenco guitars. So if you wanted to play flamenco on these guitars, you could. And if you wanted to play classical guitar on these, of course you could, because there were, so both flamenco and classical guitarists played guitars that were built pretty much in the same way. There was no big distinction.
Hmm.
You know, it was just known as the Spanish guitar.
So did the music of flamenco begin with the guitar, or did the guitar just come to enhance what was already existing in music?
Yes, the latter. Flamenco, you know, originally was a much more the essence and the soul of flamenco is the cante, is the singing, and the gypsies, who are the carriers of the flame, not necessarily the sole creators, but certainly big contributors, developers, enhancers, like a catalyst would be, enhancers of flamenco, and in many cases also, co-creators and evolvers of flamenco. But they didn't come up with all the ingredients that comprise flamenco, but their contribution, their components, and their influence on it is what really gives it the very distinct character that it has.
Uh-huh. And did the dance evolve at the same time, the flamenco dance?
Yeah, the dance, there's, on one hand, they say that the gypsies originally come from India. And in their genetic information and memory, there's a lot of physical body language that you can recognize in Kathak and Bharatanatyam dancing from India, with the stamping of the feet and certain hand gestures that you could very well say, wow, this looks very Indian, and it's on the other side of the planet. How is that possible? Well, the gypsies got a part with it. That's one, I would say pretty solid theory, pretty reasonable assumption. The other is the flamenco isn't just one way of dancing. There's many different ways, and so there's certainly the Central Arab way of dancing. I would say is certainly is an ingredient. I would say that is worthy of consideration, if not another proof of its of its existence. And of course, given the presence of the Arabs in Spain for how long was it? 500, 600, 700 years. That's also a very reasonable assumption. So, then of course you have, in flamenco itself, you have, again, there's a lot of cross-pollination of styles. You have this is we've just discussed sort of the very popular aspects of flamenco, but there's also sort of highbrow aspects of flamenco, which certainly have an influence in and out. The classical Spanish, the Escuela Bolera. Escuela Bolera is the jota, right, which is a peasant dance from Asturias, a very unrefined dance, if I may say. And forgive me if I offend anybody, but it's it's just a peasant dance. No offense. Not very sophisticated rhythmically or musically in any way, but it's there anyway. It's there. It has some influence on flamenco in very, very broad terms. But like bolera, for example, the Escuela Bolera is a sort of a hybrid of French classical ballet with some Spanish arabesque touches to it. And it's extremely difficult to execute. It's kind of nishta hinu, nishta her, it's a little, it's very, very impactful on the body in a bad way. It's hard on your knees.
So let me ask you, because you mentioned Spanish influence and Arab influence. Is there Jewish influence in flamenco?
I believe there is, and there's a lot of detractors. Not a lot, but there's a few detractors. I won't, talk about them, but I believe there is, and the reason that I really strongly believe that is. There is something very specific in the timbre of the voice of flamenco that you can detect the father and the grandfather of this genetic sound, right? And you hear that both in the Arabic voice and in the Sephardic voice, in the Moroccan chazanut specifically, which happens to be, right across the street from Spain. The street being a liquid street, but it's very, very close. So the influence, the fact that the Sephardic Jews, whilst living in Spain for, if you count the first migration after the destruction of the first temple, almost 1,500 years, right? They were heavily steeped in the local culture at one point or another, in one way or another, especially, yes, they maintained their, purity and their culture, of course, but they were still influenced, and they were especially influenced by Arabic aesthetics and poetry and song and so forth. So they absorbed a lot of that. But again, yes, they absorbed it, but both Jews and Arabs are Semites. So the timbre of their voice is much more similar than to, I don't know, a Viking priest singing something, I mean, there's just something there on a very fundamental, visceral level that sounds a lot more alike than unalike.
For sure.
So, the Jewish influence, you'd be, and this is one thing I can't explain, but there are, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a much larger diversity of flamenco voices, and some of them really sound very like Ashkenazi singers, Ashkenazi chazanut, and that I find perplexing, because I mean, how on earth did that happen? And is it a mere coincidence, or is there something in the sort of this genetic makeup? And I don't mean to be like, I don't mean to harp on that aspect of genetic, but is there something in the sort of the memory, the deep memory of that goes way back in people's collective unconscious, or that resounds with flamenco because it happens to be one of its components.
So I want to ask you about a project that I know you're developing that really talks about the convergence of all these cultures in Spain at a particular moment. But first, I'd like to get to some music. And so I thought we would start with Así lo siento yo. Well, so first of all, lo siento means I'm sorry.
No, well, I mean, in that context.
Okay, so what does this mean? Así lo siento.
Siento also means I feel.
Oh.
From sentimiento and sentir. So basically the title means this is how I feel it.
Okay. Beautiful. Yeah. And it features some other musicians, the singers that you spoke of, a percussionist who's playing the cajon, I believe.
Yes.
And so it is a flamenco form. So could you explain a little bit about what's going on before we show this clip?
Sure. So on cajon, we have actually Manuel Guitarist, who's a phenomenal dancer, but he's really a quadruple threat. He's a great dancer. He plays cajon, he sings, and he writes poetry and letras and verses. So he's immensely talented. So he's a great, he's just bubbles with rhythm, and he expresses it amazingly well on the cajon, which is just a little history of the cajon. It's originally a Peruvian instrument. It was adopted into the flamenco by Paco de Lucia, specifically with Ruben Dantas, who's a Brazilian percussionist, and it's been part of flamenco for the last almost 40 years. And
it appears to be a box.
Yes, but you'd be amazed how many sounds you can get out of that box.
So did it begin as a street instrument? I mean, you could almost imagine like an orange crate or something.
The cajon was an instrument of the slaves. It was of the African slaves that were brought to South America, and it was a way. It was easy to disguise. It didn't look like a drum because they were trying to obviously emasculate them culturally in every possible way. So they took away their instruments, and so I believe the story goes that they were fishermen or something like that, and these boxes is what held the fish. But don't quote me on that part. But certainly the boxes had some use, right? And then it would have a functional use for it, and at the same time they didn't bang on it and just continue to make music.
Right, and you find that if you've ever played one, that different parts of the box have different sounds, even kind of a snare sound in some.
Yep.
like
Yeah.
a rattling sound. So
Yeah,
very, very interesting.
that rattling sound actually was introduced more by the flamencos than the Peruvian cajon is much more monodimensional.
I see.
It doesn't have that snap very clearly defined.
I see.
And so the again, very much in flamenco-esque way, you know, the gypsies, they take, even though in this case it was a Brazilian, but Ruben Dantas is pretty much a gypsy, as far as we're all concerned. And so they take something and they improve on it. They give it that magical touch, that you know, and adapt it to their purpose.
Sure. So let's look for the Jewish influence and soul, perhaps. Maybe not a direct influence, but the soul.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into that more later if you want.
Okay, good. But let's take a look at Así lo siento yo and see, and then I have some questions for you afterwards. And the clapping is amazing. Yeah. And I would say also look for distinct musical movements within this piece, which is going to be about 7.5 minutes. Okay. So
that's how long it is. I don't remember.
Well, you don't feel it because it's very exciting. So let's take a look at Así lo siento yo, featuring Adam Del Monte. Wow, Adam, that is it's a very exciting piece. There's a relentlessness to the music there. Like you never stop. It's just like you are having a conversation with the other people there, and it's just at a very high pitch all the time. It's extremely improvisational, but within it, as I said before, you can perceive movements happening within the music. So please explain what we just saw.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll just give a little background. You know, the word flamenco is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses many different forms within the flamenco style. So the best analogy I could perhaps give you is just like during the Baroque period, you know, a suite would be comprised of, you know, a prelude, which would be the introduction, but then you had to have at least 4 major dance types of pieces, which would be present, but then you could always add to it. So the main things that would comprise a Baroque suite would be allemande, sarabande, courante, and jig, right? So the allemande, as the word suggests, Allemand, German, right? So that was a German dance of sorts. I don't know what the original Allemand sounded like. I'm sure a lot of beer drinking was involved. You know, Allemand. Sarabande is originally again, you know, you always have revisionist history going, well, actually, you know, okay. As far as Grove's Dictionary of Music is concerned, it's a Spanish dance. And it actually started originally as a dirty dance, as a pornographic dance, and it transformed into this most dignified, profound, spiritual type of form, and it's very slow and it's very moving, and so it became, you know, it transformed from there. The courante is a French dance, but so the sarabande is a Spanish dance, as I said. Courante is a French dance. Courant comes from the word courir, to run. So it's usually a fast dance. And then the jig is the jig. It's Irish in origin. So what that tells you is that, you know, the secular Baroque music was largely based on forms that were originally popular, and they were dance forms, right? And every composer would then take this form, the characteristics of this form, and put their own, you know, sophisticated harmonic moves, melodic moves, you know, etc., within the form. You know, it had to sound like, you know, and then of course you had bourrée, you had minuet, you had lourd, you had, you know, all these other forms, which again were dance forms. And so you had a more popular version of these forms, and you had a more sophisticated version of this form. So obviously the king, for me, the Moses of music, Johann Sebastian Bach, took the elaboration of these forms, of these dance forms, and put them on a whole other level, right? So this kind of mentality, I strongly believe, and I really see that, I'm not the first one to even say it, or I thought it, and then I said, oh, they think so as well. So, okay, there's something there. But, you know, there's like this flamenco and classical music sort of developed. They started off to get more or less sort of at the same time in terms of, you know, at the like a joint big bang, but then they developed in parallel universes. So in flamenco, what you have is you have dance forms, you know, like soleá, seguirilla, bulería, fandangos, tangos, tientos, right? Tarantos. Those are all dance forms, which some of them have, you know, maybe influences from the Baroque, but, you know, that's still to be investigated. And again, I'm not an academic by any means, so that's above my pay grade. But there's a lot of, you know, the whole idea of ornamentation also in Baroque is very much a melismatic and maqam based concept, even, right? And the whole ornamentation thing is definitely very heavy in flamenco. But anyway,
can I ask you a quick question about the ornamentation? Because what you're implying there is a certain amount of improvisation. That piece seems to be largely improvisation. I couldn't tell what was and what wasn't.
Well, yeah, I was going to get to that, but here's the thing about flamenco, and this is, I don't want to be like the Penn and Teller of flamenco, where I burst everyone's bubble of mystery, give away all the magic secrets. Oh, look, he's not cutting the woman in half. This is this is just a rubber band. So I think the issue lies in how you define improvisation, and how relative it is to other more rigid forms or other even more improvised forms. So I would say flamenco really falls somewhere in the middle. Flamenco is a lot more structured and composed and pre-composed than people realize. You have different types of, some flamenco is more improvised than, or seems to be more improvised, but then when you go and see the same guy play 2 or 3 nights in a row, you realize he's improvising the same damn licks every night. Which makes you think, wait a minute, is he improvising? Well, maybe the order of the licks, or maybe how many times he'll vamp. Yesterday was 6 times, today was 8. Okay, is that an improvisation? I don't know.
Yeah,
basically the same harmonic structure. Yesterday he went dee dee dee, and today he went dee 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 dee.
Right, it's partly why. That illusion of improvisation is important. At the very end of that piece, when everybody just goes bam exactly at the same moment, it takes your breath away, because you realize, oh, they weren't just making this stuff up. This is very, very carefully planned.
Yeah, it's very carefully planned, but again, it's far from being as rigid as classical music.
Sure.
Okay, because I'll tell you this, I never play this piece the same way twice. Whereas Granada, and as far as the notes are concerned, are always the same. Right? A classical piece that I will play, the notes will always be the same. The interpretation may vary, the pacing obviously will vary. I'm a human being, I'm not a machine, but it's basically the same, right? Whereas in flamenco, what you have, I'll just basically explain that. You have 3 fundamental elements that are constantly rotating. You have what they call, again, this is all the inner jargon, right? You have what they call compás, which kind of means a lot of things, but for our purpose right now, it means groove or vamping, right? So rhythmic variations, right? Rhythmic variations.
I'm taking notes.
Yeah, okay. These rhythmic variations are, they're obviously, it's harmonic rhythm, which here is where there's more room for improvisation, because you're riding this rhythmic wave, you're grooving away, and there's obviously pre-established accents, this pre-established patterns, which are part of the language and so on, and then you can extend it, or you can fill it out more, you can fill it out less. So in that sense, there is a fair amount of improvisation within some very clearly defined parameters. And again, they're as defined as you again, you can create your own parameters within which you then choose to vary things, right? Now, can it happen that on an occasion you're very inspired, you're on stage, and you've played this thing, you're on tour of 50 concerts, and in concert number 37 you're sick and tired of what you've done all the 36 other, and you just take a chance and you just trip out on something else, then you can reach into your subconscious and boom, go into uncharted territory in the moment. Hopefully you stay within the rhythm, within the style, within this, you create a new musical problem, so to speak, which you then attempt to resolve. So that, I would say, that would be like the epitome of improvisation.
That's beautiful. So
right.
I want to get a segue here into this next piece. How much does that apply to A Pepe Habituela, which is going to be our next piece?
Yeah, pretty much the same idea, because just to wrap up that idea, which pretty much applies to all the flamenco forms. is we have the rhythm and the compass. We have a thing called falsetas, which are melodic, pre-composed melodic units, right? So this is what you were referring to as very, sort of organized, clear melodic stuff. That's a falseta. That could be, again, of any length that you determine it to be, right? And those melodic ideas, those falsetas, are interjected with and interwoven with a compass, which offer a sonic relief to the very densely melodic material, right? And then you have the third element are like what I call signature defining phrases, signature phrases, which define the characteristic of the form, right?
Not just like, the piece. You don't mean like a motif that defines the piece.
Exactly. And so if you're going to play, for example, like the next piece you're going to play, the solea, which is, again, it's a form. The title of it is A Pepe Habichuela, which is my maestro. And basically I dedicate this piece to him. That's why it's called like that. But the form is a solea, which is a 12-beat form with accents on 3, 6, 8, 10, and 12 as a fundamental skeleton that gives definition to the structure, to the phrase structure. That every solea has to have, in one way or another, these two basic licks, if you will, phrases. That's why I call them signature phrases. Every solea has to have them. If you don't have that there, your solea is not standing on a pillar. It's just like, wait a minute, something really basic is missing. It's like saying amen at the end of a prayer.
Right, or like a sonnet has to have a certain number of lines, and the rhyme has to be the same. But within that structure, you have a lot of freedom.
Exactly.
Great. All right. Well, let's listen to this now. Is this an original piece?
Yes.
It is. And so it is truly dedicated to your teacher. And I want to ask you about him after we give it a listen. So here's Adam Del Monte playing A Pepe Habichuela. So, Adam, that piece is so tender. It's and so touching, and it really tells me, without knowing your teacher, how you feel about your teacher. So, tell us a little bit about who Pepe Habituela is.
Pepe Habituela, the Habituela, Habituela is in quotes. It's like, the rapper names have got nothing on the flamenco names.
Oh, really? That's
they
interesting.
wrote the book. They wrote the book on their crazy, artistic names. I mean, you'll just, be amazed at the kinds of names. Habituela means pea, green pea, or green bean, or string bean, or something like that. String bean. So, the Habituela, his real last name is Carmona, right? Incidentally, I think it's probably a Sephardic name because it comes from the Hebrew word kerem, which means vineyard. Carmona, dueño de la viña, means, the owner of the vine, Carmona. But anyway, that's a side note. The Habituela is a clan. There's many brothers with many children, with many offspring, and they're like a clan. And they're from Granada. And Pepe Habituela is the second, sort of from his generation, he's the second son. He's now 77 years old. His older brother passed away like 3 years ago, Juan Habituela. And they were one of the most important proponents of accompanying the cante. And their style was very distinct in its, they didn't sound like anybody else. And their arpeggios and their rasgueados, their strumming sound was unique to them. It's like a family stamp, if you will.
And are you using some of that in the piece?
Absolutely. And definitely I try to, at least, And there was one specific falseta, as I said before, a melodic little composition that Pepe taught me, and then I elaborated upon it and developed it. And whenever I tell Pepe, I teach your falseta to my students. He means, you mean your falseta? No, your falseta. He says, no, your falseta. So, I've adopted it. I've taken such ownership of this falseta of his that he's practically relinquished it to me, But of course, it's his.
Beautiful.
So yeah, Pepe. I met Pepe when I was 14 years old. My father played with him. My father plays the cymbalum. He's from Romanian origin. He plays the cymbalum, and in the 80s and 90s, he was collaborating with many flamenco, artists such as the singer Enrique Morente, who was singing with Pepe Habichuela. They were a team, and my father was playing with Pepe Habichuela. So that was kind of my connection to Pepe, was of course through my father. And but Pepe and I just connected in a very special way, and he always gave it to me straight. When something, I was always trying to push the envelope in some ridiculous ways before having enough foundation at times. I'm talking 35 years ago or more, 40 years ago. And he would say, no, this is no good, this is good, this is no good. He always gave it to me straight, and his wisdom and his words accompany me, until today. And I kind of kick myself into thinking, gosh, when he told me this, that, and the other so many years ago, I just wouldn't pay attention. And that, now I realize he was right.
Let that be a lesson to all you young people out there.
Yes, exactly.
And it brings up another question, Adam, which anyone who has heard you play, this thought has to enter their mind. How did he get so good? How did that happen? It doesn't happen by accident, obviously. How much do you practice? How much did you practice? Do you still practice many, many hours a day? The precision of your playing and the confidence that you exhibit, those are things that only come with time and great effort, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there's different phases in my life where I would practice more and practice less. I wish I'd practiced more, to be honest, and I wish I'd practiced more consistently. I think I would say that my life has been one long learning experience and one long chain of mistakes and learning from mistakes. If I had to be perfectly honest, it's just one mistake after another, and then hopefully waking up and saying, no, not like that. And no matter how many times people tell you things, I was on one hand a very fast learner, because my way of learning would be by absorption, and by and then recreating the idea in my mind and teaching myself whatever I thought was happening. And on the other hand, I was a terrible student. I wouldn't listen. I was as they say in the Bible, we Jews are a stiff-necked people, am kshe oref, and I would just not heed certain advice, and then bang my head against the wall. And then after years, I would realize, no, this is how it needs to happen. Oh yeah, that sounds familiar. That's what someone told me. So, it's, I think the most important part of the process of learning is really being aware of how can you learn from your mistakes, and how can you fix your defects, find personal and creative ways of fixing your defects.
I've said this to young cantors that I think by now I've made almost every mistake that can be made as a cantor in the davening. And so therefore I can pretty much get through a service, but there are always still imperfections that you have to learn from, and then you can raise your art higher and higher with each repetition and each mistake. It's really important. So I want to move to what you're doing now outside of just playing. I say just playing. In your case, it's enough, Adam. It really is. But you have branched out into composition and into a really amazing project that is very Jewish in many ways. I wonder if you would talk about that.
Yeah. So when I lived in Madrid and I would try and get the rabbi, and there was a Chabadnik there as well on a shlichut, I would say, hey, rabbi, come and sing me in the concert. And they would say, is there anything Jewish about it? I'm like, me, that's not enough. You know, what are you expecting? Klezmer? You know, Freilich? Sorry, man, I'm an Israeli guy who plays flamenco. What can I do? You know? So that's always been kind of an issue, right? Where how do I explain myself to Jews with and reconcile my Jewish identity with my art, which on the surface doesn't seem to be very Jewish, you know. But you know, of course, there are elements of chazanut and vocal things, but again, that's a much more esoteric piece of knowledge. Most people will not. There's no way they would know that. But you know, there are flamenco forms like the seguiria and the soleá that have very strong chazanisha expressions. And when you listen to Joe Amar, the Moroccan chazan, do his thing, and then you listen to Manolo Caracol, who's a flamenco singer, and you see, my God, these are, you know, brothers from another mother. So, you know, there's so like I said before, and just to close that corner, you know, close that loop, there are clearly some, you know, connections between Jews and Gypsies and the music. And so one day, well, actually, it's all my wife's fault. And she's there in the kitchen somewhere, probably chuckling. But you know, when we started dating, I met her in Argentina. She one day, you know, it was a very, very cold winter in July, and the heater went off and everything. And she said, "Honey, have you thought of writing an opera?" You know, and I thought, I didn't want to disappoint her, so I said, "Yeah, sure." You know? And she caught me by my tongue. Really? What? I was like, oh, damn, I have to come up with something good to continue to impress her. You know, the things you will say when you just start dating. And so I kind of, thinking quickly on my feet, I kind of improvised a very quick synopsis. Yeah, well, you know, the Jewish lawyer protects the gypsy tribe from a trial from the Inquisition. He saves them. He creates a bunch of new enemies. His daughter goes off with one of the gypsy boys. They have to escape to Granada. And this happens, that happens. And then finally, guess what? They're expulsed. You know, the ears get the gypsies get their ears cut off and the Jews are expulsed. Spoiler alert. You know, 1492. And so she said, "Oh, what a great idea." I'm like, "No, yes, no." So it was half an hour of yes, no, yes, no. And then as soon as I said, "Okay, fine, it is a good idea," I didn't realize how much my life had just changed in that moment based on that decision. Because in that moment, I took upon myself to write, you know, the first flamenco opera that combined the four cultures that I'm close to: the Jewish, the Arabic, the Christian, the Gypsy.
Fantastic. You know, a few years ago, my wife and I went to Spain with Cantor's group, and we stood in the Alhambra, and we felt it, and we heard about, you know, the how the different cultures lived together and interacted, and the great poetry and art and everything that came out of that. And you just so longed for that to be a reality once again. Yeah. And so I think people would be very interested in it. What is it called, and when can we see it?
The opera is called Llantos 1492. Llantos means cries or clamors. And 1492, of course, that's a very important date, because literally the day after the expulsion, I believe Columbus set sail to find him for the Americas. And the final act, the final scene in the final act of this opera takes place exactly where you went with all your buddies, in the Alhambra Palace. That's where the edict was written by Queen Isabel, the Edict of Expulsion, El Edicto de Granada. I used parts of that is delivered by the villain in the opera at the very end, of course. You know, this opera, the fundamental aesthetic platform is flamenco, but not limited to. You know, this is the first time where I've been able to sort of break away from, you know, the kind of rigid shackles that flamenco offer in a way. Flamenco, the power of it lies also in its rigidity. you know,
Mhm.
and it's a double-edged sword.
Mm.
And always in my compositions, when I write flamenco compositions, I'm always mindful and respectful of the traditions, even though harmonically and otherwise I've pretty much created my own language and my own little innovations within that, of course.
Mhm.
But the opera, isn't just flamenco. Yes, there's like 10 or 11 different flamenco forms throughout the opera, but there's also, I just say, okay, right now I'm going to write something that's not flamenco, but it's, not in an obvious way flamenco, but the spirit of it is flamenco, but
Mm.
with a much more contemporary avant-garde treatment.
And so, what are the chances that we'll get to be in the audience one day soon?
Well, Bezrat Hashem, as we say, I have a very strong and firm commitment for its official world premiere at the Opera Southwest in Albuquerque in the season of 2022-23. So hoping that life comes back to some kind of normal and that there's some level of control of the virus and that the economy permitting. So,
Yeah.
hopefully we can fund this thing as well, of course.
Great.
To make it happen. But the Opera House of Albuquerque has committed to doing it.
Fantastic. I hope to be there for the premiere, Adam. And I will be. Let's put it that way. Unless it's on Yom Kippur, I promise to be there. So
if he books it on Yom Kippur, I'm going to say, hey, dude, seriously. Don't be like,
bad idea. The Jews won't come.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Granada. I was there. There's a palpable feeling of the Jewish community that once lived there. There's a wonderful piece called Granada that I played by Adam Del Monte that I'd like to play for you as we say goodbye. But first, I want to thank Adam. Thanks so much for all you've given. I know Adam first appeared at Valley Beth Shalom thanks to Richard Braun and the Jewish Music Commission several years ago. And once I heard you play, Adam, I just was determined that you would be a part of us. And so you have been. So thank you again for your contribution to Valley Beth Shalom, your music, your artistry, and your friendship. And I hope to see you very soon in person. Maybe you can come and sit in our sukkah. In the meantime, we'll let Adam make the final statement with this piece. A little bit of background on Granada, on the piece that you're about to play.
Well, Granada by Isaac Albeniz, only my second favorite composer after Bach, of course. But Albeniz had the unique talent of capturing and encapsulating the spirit of a city with its history and its magic like no one else. And we see that in Granada, Córdoba, Sevilla, Cádiz, and so on, Castilla, all these different pieces that he wrote of a nationalistic character just have a super distinct flavor and really capture the aroma of every city. And Granada, he just totally captures that perfect romanticism that is embedded in the history of that city.
So let's hear his music now and the music of Adam Del Monte. And thanks so much for joining me in my sukkah. And Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach and Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody.